The October 17th Select Budget Committee will come back to order. It is 1:30 p.m. I'm Dan Strauss, chair of the committee. Will the clerk please call the roll? Councilmember Juarez and Council President Nelson are excused.
Councilmember Saka?
Here.
Councilmember Solomon?
Here.
Councilmember Hollingsworth? Councilmember Kettle?
Here.
Councilmember Rink?
Present.
Councilmember Rivera? And Chair Strauss?
Present.
5 present.
Thank you. We will move right into our fourth agenda item. Will the clerk please read the short title of the fourth agenda item into the record?
Agenda item 4, Human Services Department for briefing and discussion.
Wonderful. We are joined always by Director Ben Noble. We have Jennifer Lebrecht, Jasmine Marwaha, and Tracy Ratzliff. Some of the entire Seattle City Council Central staff are part of a team that represent the best and smartest analysts in our state. Said it before, I'll say it again. So here we are as we are getting ready to present the Human Services Department. We also have Tommaso Johnson. So at your convenience, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Council Member. For the record, Tracy Ratzliff, Council Central staff, joined by my esteemed colleagues.
Hi, Jennifer Lebrecht, City Council Central staff.
Jasmine Marwaha, Council Central staff.
Tommaso Johnson, Council Central staff.
Noble Central Staff Director. HSD is big enough, it requires a team.
So we're pleased to be here this afternoon to provide a review of HSD's budget and specific policy considerations identified by Central staff to this point in the budget process. Our review and policy considerations memo provides significantly more detail and is attached to the agenda for your reference. I'm hoping that it might put a little bit of a kibosh on some of the questions that you might ask of us through our presentation, but we'll just see how that goes. So as you can see from the very first table, the 2026 proposed budget for the Human Services Department would increase by 11.6% or $45 million relative to the 2026 endorsed budget. As you heard from the department during the presentation a few weeks ago, this is a result of additional funds being added to addressing homelessness, advancing community safety, food and nutrition, public health, as well as increases to human services provider wages and contracts. Moving to the next slide, in terms of FTE changes, 9 of the 11 new full-time positions that are in the 2026 proposed budget were actually added in the mid-year supplemental ordinance. The 9 positions support the expansion of the state Washington Cares, the long-term care program. These positions provide outreach, provider network development, and beneficiary services, and these positions are fully supported by state grant funding. In addition, there are 2 new case manager positions that are added to HSD's post-overdose team that is part of the Health 99 program that's operated by the Seattle Fire Department. These positions would be supported by the new proposed public safety sales tax revenue. As it relates to changes to the key revenue sources, those are as follows: a net increase of over $27 million in the general fund, and this includes specifically $17 million in the Seattle Shield B&O tax, sales tax, and over $11 million in the new public safety sales tax. There's a net increase of $200,000 in Jumpstart funding. And then finally, there's an increase of $18.2 million in other sources of funding, which includes not only federal and state grants, but it also includes Families Education Preschool and Promise Levy and a sweetened beverage tax, for which those were used to do some swaps to relieve general fund and PET of funding obligations. Do you have any questions about this information, council members?
I'm not seeing any questions at this time.
Okay.
All right, we'll be moving into the policy considerations piece, and I will do the first 3 and then hand it over to my colleague, Jasmine. So the 2026 proposed budget provides ongoing funding for an additional 2% human service provider wage equity increase of $5.1 million. And I do want to note that that's above and beyond the 2.6% inflationary adjustment that was also provided as required under the Seattle Municipal Code. As described by Ben and Tom earlier this week, the city is facing a $140 million general fund deficit in 2027. So council will need to make a difficult decision in 2027 if it wants to sustain this wage equity increase. I think this is probably known, but failure to sustain these new investments would mean that wages would decrease for human services workers. And there are no options here, just flagging, I think, a decision pending before council in future years.
Thank you, Jennifer. Before you move on, raising my hand to be part of the process here, just to say this wage equity stabilization, as I'll call it, and parity in other ways, has been an ongoing policy proposal for a number of years. And maybe help me correct the record here, just to say that this issue was identified, I believe, in 2018, 2019. There was a first round of changes made in 2020, 2021 that didn't get quite to parity, but started taking that next step in that direction. And this budget before us, as proposed, took the next step from there, and we are not quite at parity. All of that said, we also don't have as you said, in 2027, this issue might be right back in front of us. Is that an accurate assessment?
I think that is correct. And just a little bit of history, in 2022, the University of Washington published a wage equity report that the city had commissioned for human services workers, and it found that there was a significant discrepancy between pay for human services workers versus workers in similar fields. That report recommended that the city increase human services contracts by 7% over a period of several years. And in 2024, council did provide a 2% wage equity increase. So they did essentially the 2% of that 7% recommendation, and this would provide a further 2%.
Thank you, which doesn't bring us up to the final goal, but does take another meaningful step in that right direction. And I'll also just say that a lot of the work that these contract workers are doing is on behalf of the city and to further the goals that our city has. If they were city employees, they would be already subject to our annual wage increases as part of the contract that we have with our labored employees. So this is important. I don't have anything additional to add. I just wanted to flag the history of how we got here today. Please feel free to correct any of that also.
That is just correct. And I think the main point here is, of course, once you provide a pay increase to someone, it's very hard to take it back. So this is truly, truly an ongoing cost in terms of something that the city would need to sustain.
Yep. Thank you. I see Councilmember Rivera.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Jen and Tracy, for being here. Just to clarify, though, when this says failure to sustain would that wages would decrease, I'm just clarifying. We're not actually. You're just saying they would stay static because they wouldn't do the yearly increase or however often it is. You're not saying that we would be taking money away, like that it's an actual decrease. Like they're not, or is the department going to be proposing even less funding? I guess is what I'm just trying to clarify.
Let me clarify that. It's a good question. Yeah. So I think my point is simply, imagine council adopts a budget with this 2% increase, which is $5 million. The providers, the providers will then be passing that on, or should be passing that on to their employees in the form of a wage increase, right? Employees should see an increase in their pay. That money will continue to have to be part of the baseline budget in future years in order to sustain that pay increase for human services workers. So if we got to a place next year and it was like, oh, we're not, this would be a priority to continue to identify funding for to continue.
Yeah, oh, thank you for clarifying, because that's important. It's not that it's just the increase couldn't happen. Not that we're decreasing the baseline or whatever it was from this year.
Well, the employees would have received a pay increase, and so failure to sustain that increase would mean the employee would experience it as a decrease in their pay.
Because they're not getting like that COLA. I mean, true for our employees and on a year, we're not able to do that. But I guess I just wanted to make sure the contracts aren't getting less money. Like,
The contracts,
anyway, I think you answered my question, Jen. I'm trying to like, they're not getting less contract. You're just saying they're not going to get a wage increase. Correct? Sorry.
If I might
Please, Tommaso.
just add on, adopting this wage increase in the budget you're considering now, 2026, would create sort of an ongoing expectation, not an obligation in the legal sense, but if we approve this in 26, then in future years to fail to do so, would the employees at the service providers would experience that as a decrease in the future years.
So have we done, I mean, is this the second time we're doing this?
Yes, a 2% wage equity increase was provided in 2024.
That's what I thought. Okay. Thank you guys for clarifying.
Thank you. Other questions at this time? Seeing none, Jennifer, if you'd like to keep ticking through your presentation.
All right. So the second issue is around sustainability for the new shelter beds that are part of the proposed budget. The mayor has proposed a multi-year expansion of shelter beds with the goal of 305 new units by the end of 2027. The amount of funding in the 2026 proposed budget is not sufficient to maintain a full year of operating support for those 150 beds slated to open in 2026. Essentially, the 2026 budget has about $7 million in it, which would pay for startup costs for those 150 units, plus 3 months of operating support, with the assumption that they would start up or be operating late in the year. But it would actually take $10 million a year to operate 150 beds for a full year. So at least $3 million more would be needed just to sustain those 150 beds. And then, of course, there would be additional costs to add another 150 beds. So if you look at the total number of beds, 305, the annual cost to fully operate 305 beds for an entire year would be $26 million. The budget, 2026 proposed budget, has $7 million. So those additional funds would need to be identified by the end of 2027, in the 2028 budget to fully sustain operating costs for 300 beds for a full year.
I think that's very straightforward.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, my third issue is around what we're calling what's called the Community Solutions Innovation Pilot. Again, the 2026 proposed budget contains $4 million in one-time GF for a new pilot to reduce unsheltered homelessness in downtown. The program, which is still being designed, will likely include shelter, services, outreach, and short-term rental subsidies. HSD will administer the funding, not the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, who manages funding for all other city shelters or city-funded shelters. The Downtown Seattle Association will be the lead entity and will manage a subcontract with Purpose Dignity Action, the PDA, to implement the program. The funding for this pilot is one time, and that does appear to be a poor fit for the nature of the program that is designed here. Council should anticipate that it will be asked for funds to continue this pilot in 2027 in order to avoid returning people to unsheltered homelessness. Again, just in the face of the $140 million general fund deficit, Council should anticipate making difficult decisions if it wants to continue the funding for this program on an ongoing basis. There are a few options here. One is to proviso $4 million contingent upon receiving more details from HSD on the pilot, including program design, outcomes, geographic focus area, and the plan to ensure no disruption of services when one-time funding ends. And option B is to proviso funds contingent upon them being administered by KCRHA, who again manages all other shelter contracts. Option C, reallocate the funds to another use that is better suited to one-time funding, and D, no change.
And just as a technical point here, because this is labeled as a pilot and the funding is labeled as one time, this $4 million is not part of the projected deficit for 2027. If, in fact, this program were to be continued, that would imply an even larger deficit.
Thank you. I'm not seeing questions at this time.
Okay, moving on to issue 4, the sweetened beverage tax fund swap. The 2026 proposed budget
Jasmine,
contains...
Actually, before you continue, I see Councilmember Rivera has her hand, and I'm assuming it's on the last subject rather than the forward-looking one. Councilmember Rivera?
Thank you, Chair. I was having trouble with unmuting myself. With my hand. The Community Solutions Initiative pilot, the DSA would be managing the contract with the lead folks. Is that how it runs? And the reason I ask is because I know there's admin costs associated with the contracts. And so if we're having a contract with one entity, there's ad costs there. And then if they're subcontracting with a different entity, then there's another set of ad tax. So I just want to understand how that would work.
That is what's currently proposed in the budget book. You know, in talking with HSD, they've been clear that they're still working through the program design, so things are subject to change. And I don't have a budget at this point for the pilot, so I'm not sure how much would go to administrative costs.
Thank you, Jen. I'd love more information about that, just because the ad costs, it adds up, and then it's less for the actual service. And so I don't know, sometimes it's advantageous to go through a contractor and then a subcontractor, but it costs us more. And sometimes it's better direct, but either way, I'm just trying to understand what the more information, which I understand you don't have now, because we don't know what this is going to look like. I'm just trying to, if you could ask that'd be great.
And I will say, I certainly can ask again. I did ask, for example, for a program budget and was told that they are just so early stage that they don't have it available. So I'm not sure if we will, with the time frame in which we would be able to get that information.
Okay, which is why one of these options is a proviso thing or option.
I believe that is correct.
Okay, Thank you. Thank you, Chair, for confirming. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Rivera. Councilmember Rink.
Thank you, Chair. I imagine I might get a similar answer to this question here, but I want to ask the question for the record. Jen, understanding that this is new and there's limited information on the approach or the program of this pilot, what do we understand at this point about any similarities in the approach of what's suggested here and what was tried under Partnership for Zero?
I think there are a lot of similarities to Partnership for Zero in terms of a focus on downtown, and then placing the effort to place people into not permanent housing, but to place people into housing through a short-term rental subsidy that is very similar to Partnership for Zero. I've been told that one difference in the program design is that they're also offering shelter. So the idea would be you place people into shelter and then eventually into housing with short-term rental assistance, and maybe that shelter stop offers an opportunity for additional services. But I think we could think of this as a fairly similar type of approach.
Do we know if they're intending to use a by-name list and like closing of the list type of approach either?
I don't know. I can find that out for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Fantastic. I think we're going to move on. Jasmine, I believe you have the next policy consideration.
Yes. So the 2026 proposed budget contains an additional $7.2 million ongoing of sweetened beverage tax to supplant general fund appropriations for food programs. And as you may remember from yesterday, this SBT funding is available due to a fund swap with the FEP levy. And all current SBT funded programs in deal are anticipated to be funded by the FEP levy if the ballot measure passes, except for the prenatal to 3 grant program, which that program is proposed to be eliminated. And just as a indication of what that program funds, The current focus areas in the 2024 and 2026 grant cycle of the program are healthy and equitable births, parental health and emotional well-being, and nurturing and responsive caregiving. The code also currently prohibits the use of SBT revenues to supplant appropriations from other funding sources, and the executive has proposed legislation to remove that prohibition on supplantation. Central staff's understanding is that the SBT Community Advisory Board was not consulted on the proposed use of SBT funding in HSD, nor on the elimination of the prenatal to 3 grant program, and that they oppose these measures. The 2026 proposed budget potentially calls into question the role of the CAB going forward, as they were established to provide recommendations for funding new or expanded food programs and early childhood investments with the revenues. And finally, the SBT fund is projected to be out of balance after 2028, making the ongoing funding of these food programs unsustainable in the long term. So among your options are to reallocate funds to support the prenatal to 3 grant program and sustain the food programs in HSD using another combination of funds. You could also adopt a statement of legislative intent if the proposed budget moves forward to work with the CAB and other stakeholders to reimagine the role of the CAB, potentially to focus on food programs, since the SBT would no longer be funding early childhood investments, or no change.
Thank you, Jasmine. Always option C, no change. And so I'll start off with a question here, similar to a question I had yesterday about color of money compared to level of funding. And so can you help me understand? I see the slide stating the supplementation assumes the elimination of the prenatal to 3 grant program. Is this and or other programs being eliminated or reduced in funding, or is the issue that you're highlighting here the type of money being used to fund those programs?
I believe the proposal would all the current proposed uses of SBT would be are expanding investments that SBT currently already provides. So the food banks and the meal programs that are currently supported by SBT will just would expand and supplant the general fund portions of those programs, if that's what you're asking. So the color of money all still kind of makes sense. It would just be that supplantation piece that is currently prohibited. Does that answer your question?
I think I might follow up with you offline just to save our communal time with all of the colleagues on the dais, just highlighting my interest to make sure that we're continuing to fund the programs that have received funding in the past.
I see. So the prenatal to 3 program will no longer be funded.
Okay.
Yeah, so
at all.
The policy consideration is to note that there is one such program that that would not continue. Sorry, just to clarify. So it's raised to 2 issues. One is there's a funding swap to sustain most of them, largely to the levy, not exclusively, and then but this one would not be. And then the other issue, just to highlight it, because I know I've talked to several of you about dedicated funding sources. We had this advisory board that was advising on this dedicated funding source, but we've now this proposed budget would structure it in a way where that advice no longer makes as much sense, because those funds are being directed internally to HSD, but they have potential to be advising in a broader sense about the use of those monies, the use of monies in the city generally, about some areas of interest, so potentially food, but others as well, depending on your interests.
Thank you. And Director Noble, just since you've jumped in, can you remind me from our revenue forecasts over the last number of cycles, sweetened beverage tax has been volatile and dropping consistently. Is that my recollection? I guess I'll find out on Monday.
Yeah. There was a drop associated with the pandemic, because it includes restaurant sales and the like. If I recall, it has since stabilized to a degree, but there is also, as I recall, sort of a market shift away from soda and towards sparkling water and stuff. So I think there is, and some of this is the goal of the tax itself. So what I recall is that it's stabilized, but not growing, and the cost of the programs that it's directed to, of course, do grow. Again,
that's right.
A challenge about a dedicated revenue source, particularly one that has a policy purposes designed for it to decline.
That's helpful. I'll just make my statement and then I'll pass it off to my colleagues before I make more, which is just to say the programs that the Sweetened Beverage Tax Fund are incredibly important, and the tax is not large enough to meet the needs of those funding buckets. Said another way is it's important to fund food banks and meal providers, and the amount of money that the Sweetened Beverage Tax provides us is not enough to fund them at the levels that I believe we should be funding them. There's no question there, so I will turn to my colleagues for their next questions and statements. Councilmember Rivera and then Councilmember Solomon, and I'll hold the remainder of my comments to the end.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for articulating that, because that just seems to be the prevailing across the board. There are just so many needs, and our budget can't sustain all the needs, and we try to do the best we can. I do have a question, Jasmine, about the prenatal to 3 program, because I see you have option A, but I think the other option is to fund, so I know we give funding to public health. So could we transfer the prenatal to 3 grant program to the public health bucket? Because to me, healthy births is a public health, in my mind, thing. So could that also happen?
I believe, yes, you could appropriate money in that bucket. I don't know if there's currently available funds within the public health, as I'm not the staffer for that, but yes, it doesn't have to be Deal that administers the prenatal through grant program or HSD, or yeah, I could definitely, you have options. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. Yeah, especially since Deal that's not their line of work, but public health seems like another likely, if we're able to accommodate that. And what is that funding?
1.5 million.
1.5. Thanks for the reminder. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Solomon.
Yes, actually, my question was actually to the funding. How much money does the sweetened beverage tax provide for us? What's the latest calculation as to how much we're taking in on that?
So I have their financial plan in front of me here, and it looks like in 2026, they're expected to generate $22.2 million in revenue. About $2.8 million goes to the Department of Neighborhoods for their food program. There's proposed $12.6 million going to HSD. $6.4 million goes to OSC for Fresh Bucks. And there's $356,000 that goes to parks for, I believe, their summer and after-school meal program.
Okay, and from what I'm understanding, that amount has been going down because we're seeing people move away from buying sweetened beverages in Seattle and going to more seltzers and those kind of things.
It looks like Ben wants to take on that question, but I can respond.
I happen to have data from 24 and 25. I don't know if you have data going further back.
Oh, okay. No, 24 and 25.
Okay.
Yeah, you go ahead then. I did want to make sure. I wasn't trying to steal the thunder, just making sure you had the data too.
So I think, I mean, as you said before, Ben, I mean, generally there was the revenues have plateaued, so they went down, I think more significantly post-pandemic. And they have plateaued. I think next year they're anticipated to generate 21.7 million, so slightly down, and then 21.2. But I think more of the issue is that as we use ongoing as we have ongoing expenditures that are expected to rise with inflation, it kind of starts to put things out of balance.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you, Councilmember Solomon. Councilmember Kettle.
Thank you, Chair Strauss, and thank you, everyone, for coming. I made mention earlier about the Dream Team. Actually, Chair Strauss made some references to the Dream Team. And sorry, Mr. Johnson, but what we have here is the Redeem Team standing in for LeBron James, Kobe Bryant, and Dwayne Wade. So to ensure that we're covered on the human services side, as I've been talking about, side, public safety and human services, meaning that, Director Noble is that seam holding everything together. So thank you, Director Noble, for that. And to have the Redeem team join the Dream team from earlier. I appreciate the briefing because it does highlight different pieces that need to be raised, and one of them is the challenge of one-time budget actions and what can be described as an ongoing need. That will be a challenge that will need to be addressed at some point, maybe sooner or later, but it will be addressed, and that's going to be a challenge. I noted the question about the shelter beds. This is like a piece, and I've been engaging with KCRHA quite a bit, for a number of different areas, to include last year's 2 non-congregate shelters, and it's been part of my education over the last year as I've jumped into housing and human services. And part of this too could be related to federal response, and is that something that could be playing into this? And I'm talking like from a budget perspective. Is that something that could be, helpful in terms of addressing, in terms of the squaring the budget circles that are out there? Kind of going back to the first point I made. Is that something that could be, part of that discussion?
I will respond to what I think is your question, and then let me know if I don't get it. The proposed budget does have a $9 million reserve of additional that's the source of which is the additional B&O tax if voters approve the initiative later on this fall. And that is to provide sort of contingency money in case things change at the federal level for housing and shelter. I think the primary concern right now is around the continuum of care funding. Right now, we have about $24 million of continuum of care funding that is supporting mostly permanent supportive housing in the city of Seattle. So a change, for example, in eligibility rules that means COC, that permanent supportive housing can no longer qualify for continuum of care funding, could be really problematic. So I'll say that there is a concern about both creating new shelter units, given that we know we don't have a sufficient number to serve the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and there's a concern about just maintaining and supporting what we currently have in the face of federal funding changes that could really impact the ability of our current system just to sustain. So I don't, that's general context. I don't know if that's answering your specific question.
It kind of goes to it. It's good to raise the point and put it on the table, like what we were just talking regarding federal response and its impact on the world of Human Services Department, particularly if there's any requirements being laid down by the federal government and those impacts, because that could be major, and continuum of care being one, and just talking through that's important. And I also like your point about adding new versus maintaining the old, which kind of goes to the Seattle Housing Investment Plan response and discussion that we've had with OH, and it's like this is HSD's version of that. And I think those are the strategy behind it. And it's kind of going to the question, is like the strategy in terms of the flexibility and the nimbleness to work these pieces, because there's a lot of unknowns too. And that's kind of the genesis of the question. So thank you for your response, because it kind of speaks to it. I think it's hard to have a complete answer because there's so many unknowns and there's so many factors to this. So I appreciate that. I recognize the points on the Community Solutions Initiative pilot. I think this is different, and I'd like to say first, with regards to the KCRHA, I do support the regional approach, and I support the reforms that we put in basically this time last year, and and moving forward in that regional approach, because this is a regional issue has come up. I made mention the other day regarding a podcast. There was a second podcast, the Blue City Blues podcast, that was talking about Little Saigon in that area, and the issues of folks. We're a mobile society, mobile country, and in that podcast was talking about 2 individuals. One was from Gig Harbor, one was from Port Townsend. So we have to have this regional approach, and one could argue we need to be broader than King County, but so I support that. But I look at this pilot as trying to test case, it's the combination effort, with the with the care piece, the support piece located. I know there's many that talk about, housing first, and from my position is sure, as long as it's a photo finish with care, wraparound services to go with that, because otherwise, that creates its own issues. So I think this pilot is trying to have that combination, but I do recognize the points that you're making, but as a test case, it could be valuable to show, this combination and how effective it can be. And so that's the way I look at that. And I kind of view it as separate from KCRHA, but it could be informing for KCRHA in terms of the work that they do. And the last bit, too, is I really appreciate the conversation that you're having, and also with Chair, regarding the sweetened beverage tax, because it just goes to the point. There's a bit of a theme, and this year's definitely with the B&O and the 0.1% public safety sales tax, and last year's changes with PET. There's some fluidity, there's some adjustments, there's changes, and I think it's good to recognize those and then be smart about the changes. So talking through the sweetened beverage tax impacts and that, we do need to be careful and smart about that in terms of, locking in something that may backfire down the road. So thank you very much that was the best I can come up with, by the way, Redeem team, to match this morning's Dream team. So, Chair, thank you.
Thank you. I think, Councilmember Kettle, you're touching on the fact of the amount of respect that the council members, myself included, have for central staff analysts and our just desire to always uplift you, not intending to call out one group or the other for being better. Best analysts in Washington State. Councilmember Rivera, I see you've got a new hand.
Thank you, Chair. All right. My question is back to slide 4 on the shelter beds. So can you explain a little bit? I was trying to figure out the math on this. So almost $8 million of ongoing funding to cover the startup costs, and then 3 months of operating the actual 155 beds. I imagine that includes finding a place to put the beds. And then it says in 27, at least almost 3 million in additional ongoing just to sustain those beds. But then it says 10 million would be needed for startup and partial operating costs for the additional 150 new units. So can you just and then in 28, the cost to operate all through 100 beds would go up to 26 million. So I'm just trying to understand how this math is working here. It's because startup costs are usually one-time costs, but I mean, it seems like a big chunk for ongoing, and then there's additional startups. So can you, sorry to make you rehash this.
No, those
slide.
It's a lot of numbers. And so I'll say a couple of things. One, it's a phased delivery, right? So there's units being phased in over time. I think another important thing to note, the 7.8 million, for example, that's added in the 2026 budget, it's serving two purposes. In 2026, a good chunk of that is just for startup costs, right? One-time startup cost. But in 2027, when these units are operational, that money is going to sort of roll over and become operating support. So it's entered into the system as ongoing. So there's 7.8 million that will, at this point, entered as ongoing into the system. In 2027, it's going to actually cost closer to $10 million, or did I do that? Actually, probably with 7.8 plus 2.9, so closer to $11 million, just to keep those 155 new units open for the entire year.
So Jen, this is where, because it says startup and operating costs. So how much of the, presumably, if part of the 7, 8 of this, I'm calling it almost 8 million is for startup and operating. Well, so how much of that is startup? Because startup we won't have to do again. Then we're just doing ongoing. See what I mean? So now this is where I'm like not clear. Why would that be then why would we do then continue to do startup? That's, I guess, my question.
I think a different way to think of it is that in 2027, you won't have startup costs, but
Right.
you will have 9 more months of operating cost. And so that 7.8 million is being rolling over to 2027. And in 2027, its job is no longer startup. Its job will be to pay for the ongoing operating costs of those 155 units.
And this is my confusion because we already have the 155. We're going to use the 7.8 to both start it up and do them. So is it more because it's 3 months worth, and then in 27 that amount will go for 12 months? Exactly. Is that?
Yep.
I just want to, okay.
Yep.
But then in 28 we have the startup again being mentioned. So some of the 10.7 will be startup again, or is it just strictly then? For the 300, the operating cost will be 10.7 with no startup, is just, maintaining, or you're saying there'll be additional startup because we're adding then the other half of the beds?
Exactly. So in 2027, there's 2 things happening. There's like about $11 million that's needed just to maintain let's call it phase 1, the 155 units that are part of phase 2. And then there's startup cost associated with phase 2, which is the remaining 150 units, plus 3 months of operating support for those phase 2 units. And then you roll into 2028, and then you're just talking about all operating costs for all the units all year.
And is this being implemented by whom?
The vision here is that this money would go to KCRHA, and they would run, for example, the request for proposal process.
Because they do the shelter beds for us now. Correct? Sorry.
Oh, sorry, I said they made up. Yes, that's correct.
Okay, I just confirmation. Thank you, Jen. And do you know how much of startup costs? Like how much are the startup costs versus the operating?
I'll get back to you. I know that what they're envisioning is that some of the units will be tiny house villages where the startup costs are relatively low, but they're also envisioning, I think, more, at least half of the units will be more of DESC's Star Center model, which is, in a building where you probably, you're offering much more intensive supportive services. And so the startup costs are higher than you might anticipate because that's going to be tenant improvements and things that are just more expensive than setting up a tiny house village.
And additional services, which was going to be my next question. So this is not just a shelter bed, it's some services associated with giving that person a shelter bed.
Yeah, all the units will have services associated with them, but some of the units will have more intensive services for people who have significant behavioral health or substance or need assistance with substance abuse disorder. So when you look at the per unit cost, it's higher than what you might see, for example, with the tiny house village because there's more intensive supports provided.
Great, but that's great because I've always said we need to make sure people have services because that's what's going to ultimately help them in addition to having shelter. Thank you, Jen, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Colleagues, other questions, comments? And I'm not sure that we formally moved to the final slide, which is questions, but I think all of the council members up here had reviewed the presentation well enough that they knew that that was the next step. I see Councilmember Rink with her hand, but we are at the point in the conversation where typically I would have the chair of the committee overseeing the department make some statements. Councilmember Juarez is excused sick today, so I've made some comments earlier. We'll let those pinch hit for her. And Councilmember Rink, was that an old hand, new hand?
was a new hand, but happy to let you go first.
Nope, that's all I have to say. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Colleagues, I want to just circle back on the Community Solutions Initiative pilot, and I know that Councilmember Strauss is usually the historian of this body. I wanted to offer some of my own historian and context when it comes to this particular investment. For those who aren't familiar with what the Partnership for Zero pilot was, it was a public-private partnership on focusing on resources to downtown to address unsheltered homelessness. And so that program did, that pilot program did wind down infamously. I encourage folks to read about not just the program, but also some of the reasons why it wound down. The thing that I want to draw attention to here is the limited amount of information we have about what is being proposed here in terms of program design. And I understand for Partnership for Zero, DSA was a partner as a part of the implementation of that. And so I just have some very real questions around what kind of attention to overviewing what elements of Partnership for Zero, understanding that it was a mixed bag. I mean, over 230 folks were housed through that program. What are the lessons that we've learned from Partnership for Zero, and how are they going to be applied here? And I think it's worthwhile to ask some of our partners for more of that information, particularly here, since there are folks who are a part of that previous effort. And I think that's critical information that we should consider before moving forward on something like this. I know I certainly have those questions. So I wanted to offer that for the record today, and I'll certainly be wanting more information from our partners. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else, colleagues? I'm seeing none. If I will also touch base on slide number 4 about the sustainability of the additional shelter beds, all to say that we need more shelter in our city right now. We also need to be investing in the permanent, supportive, and affordable housing for people to move into. This slide helps us see very plainly that every time we open a new shelter bed, it costs more money, not just this year, but in the long run. And the best practice, in my opinion, is to have a better utilization of our current shelter beds so that we can serve more people with the existing infrastructure that we have. And what that requires is that more permanent supportive housing and more affordable housing is built so that people can quickly transition out of that shelter. Again, if we begin using housing money to fund shelter, we are stubbing our toe because we need that affordable housing to be permanent. And if we're spending all of that money on shelter, we're undercutting our own goals here. So I really appreciate this because it puts it in plain view as to what we're setting ourselves up for. And we're at a point in our city right now where we need both. We need more affordable, we need more permanent supportive housing, and we need more shelter that is non-congregate, that has 4 walls and a door that that person who's living in there can lock for themselves. With that, I've got nothing more, and I see Councilmember Kettle, you've got your hand.
Thank you, Chair Strauss. I just wanted to, I appreciate your comment, and it really highlights the need to have, a great rundown that shows the strategy. And this kind of goes to the Seattle Housing Investment Plan, the memo that we got from OH, and having a version of that from HSD potentially in terms of showing the trade-off, showing the strategy, because I think the Seattle Housing Investment Plan that we got from OH was very helpful for the reasons that you're talking about. And I'd like to expand it, so don't be surprised if there's something out there on that. But to capture on one end permanent supportive housing, or now social housing on the other, and in seeing the trade-offs and understanding the trade-offs, and I could see there's some potential equivalents on the human services side that play into this, and that's an area of interest for me. And I would love to, if the Redeem team had any thoughts on that kind of subject, I'm all ears, and because I appreciate the effort that went into like last year's and then the work that relates to what OH has been doing. So thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Colleagues, any final comments now? Anything from this fantastic team of Council Central staff analysts on this presentation? Well, nothing else, then I will move into good of the order. Councilmember Saka, you got something? Maybe for good of the order, great. So we're going to make a couple announcements. I know Director Noble has some things to share. I will share about process over the next 48 business hours, not 48 hours. And I appreciate everyone keeping their comments focused so that we can be ready to watch this next moment, to seize the moment. Over to you, Director Noble.
I'm going to move, but I'll do it from the far end of the table here. I was just going to remind you, when we started this 2 full days ago, I mentioned that there are policy consideration papers for all the departments, not just those that are presented. I'm going to use this little visual. I have a notebook of them. There are 32 additional, I counted, almost 100 pages of material. There are 3 departments with, you could read through all of these. There are 3 that have specific policy consideration issues that I just wanted to highlight for you and that you could choose to read in greater depth. And I'm just going to highlight them here real quick. One is Seattle Center. There isn't a pressing policy consideration issue there, but the budget documents themselves note that there is a good deal of one-time funding being redirected within Seattle Center's resources to sustain their operations for 2026. So within Seattle Center itself, which is not generally a general fund supported department that gets some general fund but are largely financially independent, they have their own sustainability issue. And as part of that, they are at a policy level considering potential options for additional revenue. And those are some things that may come forward to you next year. So just highlighting that one. With regard to Office of Economic Development, there are a number of proposals there that you might want to consider and take a look at. Some of them one-time uses, but there's a significant investment of resources there that some of them better defined than others, but again, an area that you may want to take some time to peruse. And then lastly, the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs. As part of the federal backfill allotment, there's $4 million being directed there, and if you read the policy paper, there's a description of where that money goes, and the consideration raises the question of whether those allocations are directed essentially specifically enough towards the emergent needs that we're seeing literally in the street. And that's a policy judgment of yours. Just wanted to highlight that you may want to spend some time looking at that one as well. So again, Seattle Center, Office of Economic Development, and Immigrant and Refugee Affairs would be places to start, and there's additional information throughout.
Thank you, Director Noble. And as I was perusing through those reports myself, I noticed one area of federal rollback on funding that we haven't discussed, and maybe we did, but it was discussed in amongst many other reductions of revenue, which is the Office of Emergency Management has 2 positions that have been funded by federal grants that are no longer available to us. That was an important thing to see highlighted, and I took note of it as well. So Councilmember Kettle, just saying that so you hear it as well. Colleagues, moving into the next 48-hour business hours of the budget process, we have on Monday, the morning, the Joint Forecast Council, which is made up of the Executive Council President Nelson and myself. We will be meeting here in chambers, even though it is not a council meeting, so that we're able to utilize the technology that is built into this room. We will then have a presentation that afternoon from Director Jan Duras about the revenue forecast so that you're able to engage with him. We've changed this format a little bit because we had, I think, 6 or 7 analysts up here for the last time that they came to council, and really we just need to talk to Director Duras. So we're changing that up to make it work a little bit more smoothly. Following that, on Tuesday at noon, the web form for amendments will close. Reminder here, check in with your colleagues about co-sponsorships. If somebody drops off, we have until about Thursday to fix that, but once we get past Thursday, we're not going to have much more time, so that just to enable our central staff analysts to do their work. So we're here to work with you. We're just here to keep the work moving forward. So that's the next 48 business hours at the Select Budget Committee. We've got the revenue forecast on Monday, followed by amendment deadline. The following week will be the council member budget proposals as presented by council central staff, which is why we need to have that deadline on Tuesday so that they can create those amendments and those presentations for the following week. With that, is there any other good of the order, colleagues? Councilmember Saka?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to thank Central staff in advance, well, for all the hard work so far and all the hard work that lies ahead with all of our various amendments. I know it's a heavy lift, and this time of year in particular is a stretch effort by all on this floor. But want to thank Central staff. And then just for a point of personal privilege, Mr. Chair, I just want to say, go Mariners.
Let's go.
I'm not defeated or dejected. I'm inspired and hopeful. And, you know, we're going to perform well tonight. I feel it. I also personally figured out the reason for our lack of success over the last couple days. It's because the first 2 games of the series, the Mariners wore the Nintendo Switch 2 patch. And during games, strangely, for some reason, games 3 and 4, they switched to the classic Nintendo logo. It's the patch, folks. Baseball is literally the most superstitious game of all sports. It boggles the mind why, like that decision was made. Switch it back. Switch 2. Thank you. Go Mariners.
Let's go Mariners. Refuse to lose, believe, and seize the moment. Colleagues, if there's no further business to come before the committee, this does conclude the Friday, October 17th Select Budget Committee. We will come back to order on October 20th, Monday, October 20th at 2 p.m. Only written public comment will be accepted on Monday's meeting, and the next time for verbal public comment is on Tuesday, October 28th. Thank you, colleagues. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we are adjourned. Let's go Mariners.